Martial arts in science fiction is probably one of the geekiest things you can think to dissect. Why would you dissect it when it's science fiction and fantasy anyway? When everything there is supposed to be false and fake, well, what does it matter? Well, as a martial artist, I find it fascinating to talk about fantasy worlds and sci-fi worlds in which the martial arts in those worlds haven't been invented yet. Like we can invent them, right? So what would be the needs? What would be the actual parameters of martial arts in a fantasy setting? Like for instance, in the book series The Expanse, now this is the DVDs of the series, but in the books it mentions that, and in another book called Seven Eves by Neil Stephenson, there's a mentioning of grappling being the most effective martial art in space. And if you think about it, it makes total sense. I've thought about it before, that if you punch anyone in space, right, it would be like what they call ejection mass. It's like if you hold something and you're in zero gravity, no matter how small, like a little rock, if you throw it, the rock will go zinging, but you'll also drift slowly, right? So there's always like, if you punch something, the force would go back into you as well. You would float away. So grappling would be the way to fight in zero gravity. And they talk about it in The Expanse. They talk about it in, like I said, Neil Stephenson's novel, Seven Eves. So I'm always curious, as a martial artist myself of 20 years, I try to rack my brain and think, what would be the needs of a martial art in any given fantasy system? Whether it be Harry Potter or Star Trek or Star Wars, depending on the specific needs of those characters in that story, what would be the most effective way to combat someone? And Star Wars has very unique enemies. Everything from weird giant slug monsters like, the Hutts, to Jedi, to Sith, who have slightly different powers, it seems, at times than the Jedi. So what would you need? So let's talk about that. Let's dissect everything from Terraskasi to Nyman and the 7 lightsaber forms. And I know most of it's, pretty much all of it is done for the sake of fantasy, for the sake of fun, and a lot of it's fudged, because most people don't know how to fight. Well, I do. So let's talk about what would be required, and let's talk about Star Wars saber combat itself.
For this video, I'm going to be using relevant clips from both Star Wars and other media, as well as my own training videos, to demonstrate each of my points. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is footwork. Footwork is often seen as the most boring aspect of martial arts, but it happens to be one of my favorite aspects. Mostly because every single martial art has its own philosophy about how one ought to move in combat. Some martial arts, like boxing, are about standing there in the pocket, so to speak, taking punishment, while being mostly evasive with the head and the body, relying on footwork mostly as a means to angle the body for an attack. In boxing, what's called the sweet science, footwork is a bit more subtle as compared to Kung Fu, where you have big steps like this one, wide horse stances, and long bow stances. In martial arts like Filipino Kali, which is totally centered around knives and sticks and improvised weapons, footwork is fast and diverse and all over the place, with careful drills for what's called ranging, to be just outside of your opponent's strikes while still being in position to range back in and attack your opponent. For lightsaber combat, I'm going to suggest that the Filipino approach to footwork is more ideal. Why? It's simple. While in the movies, the lightsaber is often treated like a toy, being spun around wildly in huge flourishes, in the real world, a lightsaber would be much like a chainsaw, in that if you were to even be grazed by it, the effect would be devastating and immediate, and probably life-altering. You want to live to fight another day and have your body in good working order, so ranging drills like this one would probably be needed. Also, the lightsaber has the unique trait of being a weapon that can be turned on and off, literally dousing the blade down to just the hilt. Not only would this be perfect for baiting opponents into range, only to switch off your weapon and let them go sailing past so that you can reignite your lightsaber and attack them, it also means you can use your lightsaber hilt in what the Filipino martial arts call palm stick tactics. You could even attach a small blade to the hilt of your lightsaber so that if it ever accidentally became deactivated, you could still attack within range. Now let's look at the 7 lightsaber forms as they are delineated in canon. Form 1, or Shii-Cho, barely even earns a mention because, according to old canon, it was created as a means to teach Jedi how to transition from old metal swords to these newer, better tools. And that's all lightsabers were, just handy tools that were occasionally weapons against minor threats. They can open closed doors or keep a dangerous animal at bay, but since the emergence of this form predated all Sith, it was never developed for lightsaber on lightsaber combat. However, I do think that, as a writer myself, I can respect the world-building nature of putting this form into the canon, as it lays a foundation for when the Jedi transition from antiquity to a more technologically advanced awareness. This form is there for formality's sake, and that's pretty much it. Just a way to make sure the young Jedi learn to treat the saber with respect and not go twirling it around with total abandon. It just sets up basic form, that's it. But you should know that this kind of structure is important, and that all martial arts do follow the code of learn to walk before you run. Form 2 is where we actually get started thinking about real-world influences and how lightsabers might stack up in combat. In canon, this form was developed because Jedi were coming up against other Dark Jedi, which meant the dynamics had changed. It was now lightsaber versus lightsaber, and for this style, I'm going to suggest the most probable design was something like Japanese Iaido and or HEMA style arts, HEMA standing for Historical European Martial Arts. It probably began as a simple duelist art form, because there probably weren't entire armies of Sith all at once. Dark side users probably came in fits and starts, appearing down through the centuries one at a time, as they experimented with the dark side and other lightsaber forms. So therefore, one did not need to know how to fight an army of lightsaber wielders. It was one-on-one with simple, direct motions that would have allowed a practitioner to redirect strikes just slightly off-center, with simple and direct strikes put down center line. And since a lightsaber's attack could easily disarm someone with just a glancing blow, there were probably simple taps like what's called defanging the snake in Filipino Kali, where a simple attack to the hand is all that is needed, rather than, say, a more complex vine disarm. And the reason I bring up Iaido as an influence is because of that art's desire to sometimes point the blade directly at the opponent, as some other arts do as well, so that their opponent cannot accurately judge the depth of field when it comes to their blade. In other words, it becomes harder to tell just how close the blade is at times, especially in pitched combat. It also serves as a constant warning to keep the opponent at bay, and the sword on center line, ready for attack or defense. But Iaido is probably best known as the quick draw art, which means it intends to draw the weapon, strike, and neutralize an opponent before true battle begins. This would have been advantageous for a lightsaber form where every second means you're closer to death. Better to end the game quickly, although another form we'll look at later takes this quick draw method to another level. With Soresu, or Form 3, we start getting into the more fantastical aspects of lightsaber combat, which are basically impossible to truly quantify, and therefore it makes it difficult for us to determine what sort of martial arts system this could reasonably be compared to. I have trained in countless martial arts systems over the last 22 years, but none of them have taught me to deflect bullets or ballistics like that. However, there is an approach to disarming pistols that most martial arts I've dealt with have an answer for, some more effective than others, and some martial arts, such as Kung Fu, do actually have ancestral components left over from a time when they had to deflect arrows by spinning their staff so fast that it made it difficult for arrows to get through. This was considered a last-ditch effort in lieu of something better like, a shield. But hey, it's something. But here we also have the opportunity to discuss not only the effect the Force has on combat, but also address something that's been bugging me and I'm sure many of you since we were all kids, and that is this. Why are blaster bolts so friggin' slow? Regular bullets are so fast you can't even see them, so why does everyone in the Star Wars galaxy use blasters? Well, the in-canon explanation has always been power consumption and availability. For various reasons, it became cheaper to have power packs that have an absurdly large amount of reserve power, and gunpowder and bullets just tend to run out much more quickly. The other explanation is that blasters can often get through surfaces that simple slugs weren't able to. So, the benefit here is that blasters are best for mass production and costs, apparently, while gunpowder is much more expensive and has other problems, like how getting wet can stop it from working, and a bullet needs oxygen to fire. Though, interestingly enough, we know that bullets made on Earth would actually fire in outer space, since the bullets are well sealed with oxygen stored inside the bullet itself. But I digress. So, for the moment, we're going to assume that blasters are pretty much all most people need in the Star Wars galaxy, at least soldiers like stormtroopers. And since most people don't know how to fight, this mass production explanation barely passes muster, but it does pass. So then, that gives the Jedi time to actually see the blaster bolt coming, whereas they wouldn't see it if it were a common bullet. Form 3 rose up in prominence, commensurate with new blaster tech. Okay, so then, the force guiding their hand would also give the Jedi an edge against these slow, incoming blaster bolts. For this, I'm going to suggest a more flourishing style of martial art, where the lightsaber needs to be able to bounce from point to point all around the practitioner, flowing seamlessly in order to deflect random needles of energy coming from random directions. So I'm going to say something like Shaolin staff work, something less rigid than Iaido or Hema style martial arts. Okay, here's where we get a bit more intense and have a little more fun. Form 4 is sometimes called, in canon, Ataru, and the aggression form, and it is where the acrobatics come into play. It is best suited in open spaces, for getting way out of range and then leaping back into range quickly to attack, for being unpredictable and hard to hit, while twirling and barreling towards your opponent with acrobatic force. This form reminds me a great deal of Brazilian capoeira, an art I've dabbled in and occasionally incorporate some of it into my training. Now, realistically, this form would be absolutely stupid to perform with lightsaber against lightsaber. Because, remember, a lightsaber is just like a chainsaw, except where a chainsaw can cut from a single edge. A lightsaber cuts in all directions of its blade. So if you went spinning towards your opponent like this, and they were even a tad bit sensible, they could easily cut off one of your flailing limbs. Fans often point stuff like this out on their own, saying that the lightsaber flourishes are too showy, even stupid, and it sometimes takes them out of the combat. However, we have to take into account the world that has been set up for us. The Force guides an adept. My interpretation of this is like, well, have you guys ever been reaching for something you can't quite reach and trying to plug something into a slot that you can't see? If you reach hard enough, you might be able to feel around for the slot you're looking for, then place the plug straight into the socket, even though you couldn't see it. That's how I imagine the Force working for practitioners of this form. It's not exact, and you can't always see the path forward, but you're feeling it out, looking for the perfect slot to insert your lightsaber, and finding your mark. I happen to like this form. It's showy, yes, but it's cinematic. And as an old school kung fu guy myself, who got into martial arts from watching old Jackie Chan films when I was in high school, I have a special place in my heart for this. Is it viable? Mostly only in a fantasy world, where you have the Force as your ally. Here, we're going to have to kind of skip over Shien, or Form 5, because it covers a lot of what I've already covered with the lightsaber needing to be moved around fluidly in Shaolin fashion to deflect blaster bolts. Only here the blaster bolts are bounced back at an enemy. Now, some of this probably has to do with the Force itself being able to do this, or else any newbie Jedi could do it. So I'll just add that there must also be something intrinsic in the lightsaber's own energy field itself to allow this to happen. In our world, plasma shielding is a thing, though at very weak levels currently. We do know that if we could encase something like, say, a starship within a strong enough plasma field, not only could it block all forms of energy attacks, it would also keep radio waves and light waves from entering, which means the starship itself would effectively be cast into total darkness, unable to see outside of its own protective plasma bubble. So perhaps there is something intrinsic in lightsaber fields that allows this to occur. As for Nine Man, here's where we get into something I actually know a great deal about: moderation and blending. You see, I am a 3rd degree black belt and instructor in the art of Jeet Kune Do, an art created by Bruce Lee for street self-defense, with a philosophy to look at all arts and use them as a blend. Perhaps not being specialized in any one thing, but well-rounded, with a mind towards specializing down the road once you see what you're naturally good at, where your weaknesses are, or just whatever martial art piques your interest. The point is to blend everything that you know, to give cohesion and harmony to all the disparate parts, to create a style that is greater than the sum of its parts. As Bruce Lee put it, using no way as way. Or, as he also put it, absorb what is useful, discard what is useless, and add what is essentially your own. I'm also a 2nd degree black belt in Filipino Kali, a 1st degree black in Shaolin, although that black belt is old and I haven't trained much in it since, so I hardly count it, and a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a brown belt in Indonesian Silat, and I've also cross-trained in capoeira, as I've said, as well as Hema, Judo, combat submission wrestling, boxing, Wing Chun, Tai Chi, and the Kizi fighting method, as well as some Krav Maga on the side. What I can tell you is that none of these martial arts have the end-all, be-all answer to fighting, and practicing in just one of these arts makes you a specialist in 1 or 2 specific areas. What I feel like Nine Man is doing is it's trying to make someone as well-rounded as possible, adapting to different kinds of threats and opponents. The jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none approach is actually probably one of the best ways, if not the best way, to approach combat. It means that while any one of your opponents is locked into 1 or 2 things that they know well, you are able to adapt and change, controlling the tempo, or perhaps even the direction and terrain of the fight. You make it so that the opponent has to fight your way, because you know just enough of their style to counter it, and use techniques from other skill sets to force the fight in a direction you want it to go. In other words, if you know a technical stand-up from Jiu-Jitsu, and you're good enough to counter the first few holds a grappler tries to put on you, you can stand up really fast and either run away or utilize standing techniques, like punching and kicking, which the grappler will not be used to. Yes, it is true that if you get caught in a specialist domain, as we call it, you will be dominated. If you let yourself get caught in mount position by a black belt, and you are only a purple belt, you will get trashed. Or will you? Because you may have also learned other techniques from other arts about how to approach ground fighting a little differently. And because you are so well-rounded, you will be much, much better at improvisation, weaponizing your environment the way Jason Bourne is able to, and perhaps even see the will to fight drain from your opponent's eyes, once he realizes you are dangerous in more ways than he can determine at first glance. Nine Man is ideal in so many ways. Moderation? Yes. But remember, all things in moderation, including moderation. So even while you are perhaps a jack of all trades, in time, you can actually master some of the individual components to your style. In my opinion, Nine Man is the style to watch out for if you're a Jedi or Sith in the Star Wars universe. However, there is something all Nine Man practitioners should be aware of. It's an old saying, I'm sure you've heard it before. I'm not afraid of the man who knows 10,000 kicks. I'm afraid of the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. So, Nine Man practitioners, beware the man who has just one good trick that he has rehearsed to the point of mastery, because that will be your undoing. So here's something, a lightsaber form for those who just want to end a fool, and be glad about it. But seriously, Form 7 is a trip. This form has 2 names, Juyo, the classical version, which allows one to tap into their emotions and come close to the dark side to fuel their combat skills, and the legendary Vaapad variation, an even more ferocious version of Form 7 that basically asks the practitioner to relish combat and savor victory, while also taunting, inviting attacks while pressing forward, always forward, and never stopping that attack. a kind of come at me bro approach, where one has to be careful not to get too arrogant. This style was only ever practiced by 7 people, and only one of them ever rose to mastery according to Master Yoda. That's right, you know him, you love him, Mace Windu. According to canon, Windu invented this style, at least the Vaapad variation, along with his fellow Jedi Master Sora Bulk. Bulk was known as a master swordsman himself, with some tendencies towards the experimental. This style is more about the emotions, but we do know that some of the actual aesthetics and philosophy of the art were characterized by broken, staccato movements, performed viciously, with not quite total abandon, as the practitioner pushed forward against their opponent, wailing on them. The thought is to become totally embroiled in your own passions, entering a state of no mind, but a kind of focused no mind. Most martial arts try and practice the state of no mind, where your brain goes completely blank and allows the body to take over. To not overthink your actions, just do. Even then, there is emotional content, if not intellectual content, in every move you make. Mind and soul are merged, your body and its many functions harmonize, and your purpose is streamlined. For a Jedi or Sith, this style would be terrifying to come up against, certainly, since it was so rare. It was unlikely you would have any practice against such a style. However, its rarity would also mean that one need not be overly concerned about ever running into it. The interesting thing to me about Vaapad is just how close it nudges a practitioner closer and closer to the dark side. From what we know of canon, it seems like this one is the only style in all of Star Wars that is actually dangerous for the practitioner themselves, and that the longer one stays in this passionate blend of determination, no mind, and relish, the closer they come to being lost. Vaapad is a martial arts system that all should fear and respect, including those practicing it.
When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master.
Only a master of evil, Darth.
Here, we can finally see a couple of Form 2 masters at their peak, both keeping it simple and defending their center line while questing towards their opponent's own center line. There are a few flourishes here and there, sure, but this is more or less Form 2 Makashi in a nutshell. But really, this gives us an opportunity to discuss something important about lightsaber combat. We've discussed in-canon explanations for things, but now it's time to pay respects to the man who influenced Star Wars saber combat and sword combat in films in general for over 50 years. Bob Anderson had the rare title of Blade Master, with an understanding of the sword and choreography that was unparalleled. He choreographed The Mask of Zorro, all the Lord of the Rings films, Highlander, The Princess Bride, you name it, and if there's a sword fight in it, he probably did it. Anderson had to work with what he had in this fight, that being an aging Alec Guinness, who was no martial artist by any stretch of the imagination, and David Prowse, the 6'6" actor who stood in the costume for Darth Vader, and was mostly blinded by the helmet's black plastic eye visors. So, Anderson employed what we call the KISS method. K-I-S-S. Keep it simple, stupid. He used short, frenetic clashes of the swords in samurai dueling styles, so as to give the scenes energy without the scenes feeling like they were being dragged down for lack of movement. Anderson even sometimes jumped in the Darth Vader suit himself whenever the actor Prowse was having a difficult time with the choreography. Then you have Ben Burt, the sound effects guy who came up with pretty much all the iconic sounds in Star Wars. The hum of the lightsabers and the electric sounds when they clash kept audiences engaged and fearing the lightsaber's touch, elevating the action to cool status. So now we see how both Anderson and Burt cooperated to create a style in the perfect fusion of their two art forms, sword fighting and sound effects, and how future writers found in-canon explanations for why this style was the way it was. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the birth of the Makashi fighting style. Not much to discuss here, except again, the blaster bolts are moving so slow that really all a force wielder needs to be able to do is move fluidly, perhaps using the force to sense or even predict where the next shots are going to be coming from. Even though blaster bolts appear to move slower than even paintballs fired from a paintball gun, you would still need some sort of determining force to catch all of these bolts. Again, Bob Anderson's choreography came into play, but these actors are also just reacting to whatever's in their imagination, and I think one would have to be even more fluid than we see here in order to adapt to this style of combat. The only answer we have for why they can do this in the heat of battle is, well, the force, of course.
You are unwise to lower your defenses.
So this video has gone on longer than I initially intended, but it turned out I had a lot to say. So I'll just end it here and go into the other lightsaber forms in detail as the channel grows. I'll be posting more videos going into the rest of the forms from the films bit by bit, and also discussing Star Wars lore, how it was initially intended, and how writers kept adapting it to keep up with Lucas's version of events once the prequels came out, as well as how they incorporated mistakes in the films into a cohesive, if occasionally sloppy, canon. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please let me know and don't be afraid to toss out suggestions on other videos you'd like to see. Until next time, guys, may the Force be with you.